All right, check, check, check. We're about to start. Get settled down. Thank you so much for being here for our next keynote talk. So when we learned that the theme of the conference would be mobilities, that urban mobilities would be one of the main topics that we would be looking into, the first person that came to our minds as someone we would love to have here as a keynote speaker is Sanna Lehtinen. We're so happy that she's able to be here with us. Sanna is a research fellow at Aalto University in Finland in the School of Arts, Design and Architecture. She does work on aesthetics and philosophy of the city. I have to admit that before learning about her work, I didn't have an appreciation of how important aesthetics can be to philosophy of the city, critique of the politics of philosophy of the city, and city design and architecture. Sanna is a co-director of the Philosophy of the City Research Group. She's also a co-editor-in-chief of the new Philosophy of the City Journal. And tomorrow morning in the first session, there's a Meet the Editors session. We'll include the editors, editor of Techne and other journals and book series. And Sanna Lehtinen will be there as well if you want to learn more about the new journal that she is launching. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Lehtinen.
Thank you, Robert. Thank you for the kind introduction. And first I want to thank the organizers for the very kind invitation here. It's a pleasure to be in this wonderfully organized conference. It was also a really nice surprise, since I still consider myself not being that much of a professional in philosophy of technology, although I just calculated that I have been working in the field of philosophy of technology for 6 years, so I'm not a beginner either anymore. But as Robert introduced, I have been working mainly on urban aesthetics from the philosophical and applied aesthetics point of view. And my topic today is related to aesthetic potential of urban mobility futures. I think the title might be a little bit ambitious, but this is the outline of my talk. So, as I know that not that many of you are probably into aesthetics in particular, I thought that I would give a brief account of urban aesthetics in general. So what does it mean? How is it studied in the current scene of philosophical and applied aesthetics? And then I will move to the topic of aesthetics and mobility more in particular. I will be presenting towards the end of my talk a case which is a research project, Urban Aesthetics in Motion, that was a joint project by the University of Helsinki, Aalto University, and the city of Lahti in Finland. And that's when we really put into practice some of the philosophical concepts and kept on working and developing those concepts further in the context of urban mobility futures. So the aims of my talk are to zoom specifically into the intersection of urban aesthetics, philosophy of the city, and philosophy of technology. And one of the aims is also to situate aesthetics in the current mobility discussions. And I hope that after the talk you will have a better understanding of how aesthetics can contribute to this emerging field of studying urban mobilities and with the future perspective in particular. So, about urban aesthetics in general, how it's studied currently in the context of philosophical and applied aesthetics. There is an interest in understanding urban experience in a bit more precise, particular way. How do we experience cities, contemporary cities, also globally, very different kinds of urban environments. And aesthetics zooms into the look and feel of a city in particular. So how it becomes perceived through the senses, through sensory perception. But we are of course not only interested in how it becomes perceived, but further on how the urban environment is further evaluated, appreciated, and what kind of aesthetic values do we attach to urban places. And urban aesthetics, the current branch that I'm also working on in my own research kind of focuses on aesthetic experience as a specifically multisensory engagement. So not only visually oriented approach to understanding how we experience cities, but really trying to take into account how all different senses really are part of the experience, and how cities really produce these kinds of affordances that we then perceive sensorily. In aesthetics and in environmental aesthetics in particular, there is you can divide approaches roughly to descriptive aesthetics and to normative aesthetics. So with the descriptive aesthetics, we mean that part which tries to describe what kind of elements there are to be experienced and sensed in the first place. But the normative dimension then focuses on explicating what kind of environments would be, for example, livable, beneficial for the human life form or other more than human species. And when we discuss aesthetic values, that really refers to what is considered to be beautiful or ugly. These are maybe the most commonly known aesthetic concepts, but we might refer more generally into what is considered to be interesting or important. What are the things that draw our attention in the urban environment in the first place? And we have to take into consideration the different roles of the experiencer. So are we discussing the inhabitant's perspective? Are we taking into account how tourists experience environments when something is completely new and unexpected? What are the commuters' perspective to experiencing urban environment? What other types of roles there might be. So all these kind of have to be taken into account, and we cannot expect that only one approach or one point of view would apply to all of these different roles. And in urban aesthetics, how I have been developing the branch of aesthetics further, it is a combination of cognitive and non-cognitive approaches in environmental aesthetics. Phenomenology is quite strongly there present in understanding how human senses and sensory perception works. Then also post-phenomenological philosophy of technology has been very helpful, since I think there is a very kind of intrinsic understanding that aesthetics matters, and aesthetics are related to affordances of urban design and all different elements in the urban environment. So that has been very influential in the current developments in urban aesthetics. Urban life world is a very useful concept in the aesthetic point of view. So trying to understand what is lived and experienced quality in urban environment. So this kind of already pointing towards a normative dimension that we want to understand what would increase the quality of life. And again, taking into consideration that cities globally can be quite different, although there are many similar elements to them, especially relating to mobility choices or transportation modalities. There are a lot of similarities, but also a lot of differences. So how to take this into consideration when discussing the aesthetic factors. And senses, of course, this kind of sensory perception is at the very base of aesthetic understanding of the urban experience, but we have to take into account how our knowledge of the places, of the urban phenomena, how our imaginative capacities, how our personal memories, accumulating experiences also affect the experience. And then we, as humans, tend to have sometimes very emotional responses to the things that we experience and sense. So all these contribute to the aesthetic experiences. And of course, we are discussing very much this in the sense of an individual. So there might be great differences between individuals in how we assess places, but there are also more broad social and political factors that determine aesthetic values. So we might be part of some kind of community that kind of dictates our taste to a certain extent, or we might participate in understanding, appreciating trends also in urban design, for example. So this has to be taken into consideration. And it's good to remember that city as an environment is always characterized by diversity, constant change, so temporal change of short-term nature, of long-term nature, and also great variety in the amount and quality of stimuli. So cities are quite rich aesthetically. And this also means that there is a lot of fight for attention in a certain way. So there might be some things that we don't pay conscious attention to, yet they still aesthetically can affect us, especially on an everyday basis. And then also what Robert referred to in the introduction, aesthetics is related to the uses of the city, so who can use the city, for what type of purposes, for what type of uses cities are kind of designed towards, and these uses can be signaled and very often are signaled by different types of affordances. So mobility affordances is an example of this. What type of expectations do we have for the kind of regular general urban dweller? How much flexibility is there for disabilities, for example, referring to Ashley Shu's wonderful keynote earlier today. One way of defining these all different types of layers in urban aesthetics is this distinction between macro and micro aesthetics. So this kind of helps to, first of all, get the overall picture of how we assess cities in general. This layer refers to representations, very often landmark monuments, first impressions of places, some very recognizable features of a city. And this can even refer to city branding, so what kind of elements are considered to be emblematic of a place. And this is a very kind of easily discernible, easily understandable dimension of urban aesthetics. It very often refers to the visual emphasis in our assessment, so we can talk of the look of the city. And this is because oftentimes when we encounter these type of representations, we draw attention to surface qualities of places. And referring to Thomas Leddy's distinction between ordinary and extraordinary experiences, this would be the layer of extraordinary experiences, something that doesn't necessarily take place in the everyday experience. And borrowing from sociology, the concept of the tourist gaze also refers to some similar issues. It can also be used in a very kind of heavily commercialized way to make certain elements in cities like really recognizable and emblematic of the place. For example, for many of us, we might be visiting Tokyo for the first time or haven't been here for that long, so many of the features that are very common for the inhabitants of the place, they might seem very surprising and new and kind of aesthetically very rich and refreshing because it's our first touch into this type of urban culture. But this is also a way of seeing the city, understanding the city that can be open for the inhabitants. And very often this includes seeing the familiar in a new light. So there might be something exceptional happening, something extraordinary. Urban festivals, for example, can offer insight into this type of new experiences where you get to see something that you encounter on a daily basis, but then it kind of gains new meanings through the activities. And this layer of the experience can also be enhanced by the use of technology, which I have been studying in my joint articles with Vesa Vihanidioki a few years back. But this macro aesthetics perspective is by no means the only way of approaching aesthetics in the urban environment. This is something which has been studied already for quite some time in the context of everyday aesthetics. So the micro-aesthetic layer really tries to understand how the city becomes experienced within the context of the everyday. And this means understanding how our routines, how our habits, how everyday rhythms, activities, and relations between people and artifacts, other elements in the urban environment, how they really mold our everyday experience on a very, very mundane daily basis. And this is not necessarily so much visually oriented as we are accustomed to thinking from aesthetics. So this really takes into consideration much better the multisensory layer of experiencing the city. We come closer to the street level, so to say. And we have been describing this as the aesthetic undertone of everyday life. So what are the things that affect us on a daily basis, which are present always in our most mundane quotidian activities? And this would be, in Thomas Leddy's words, the ordinary experience layer in the city. So something that is easily contrasted with the extraordinary. And Alko Haapala in his work has been describing this as a fluctuation between familiarity and strangeness. So the familiar elements are always there present, but then the unexpected, the strange, the ever-evolving, extraordinary activities can change suddenly even the most familiar environment for us. And if we then zoom to aesthetic values, which are present and kind of form based on both the macro and micro aesthetic layers, and they are by no means exclusive, like most often the macro and micro layer take place also simultaneously. We're able to zoom in and out within our experience. But aesthetic values form as a result of both of these kinds of layers and as our relation to the city evolves through zooming in and zooming out. So urban experience can be approached as an aesthetic compromise. So there are always elements that are kind of undesirable for our individually, from our personal perspective, or even collectively. There might be places and environments that kind of don't necessarily deserve the aesthetic attention that we would like to give them. But aesthetic appreciation requires essentially having knowledge about the processes that produce and maintain them. This is something that has been developed further in everyday aesthetics and environmental aesthetics. So it goes very much against the Kantian idea of disinterestedness in aesthetics, especially in philosophy of art, that aesthetic experience would be somehow always detached from other values. And instead, the closer we get to the everyday realm, the more important it is to understand that different values affect also our aesthetic appreciations. But to what extent, that depends a lot on the context. But these aesthetic values in the urban case specifically are linked to, for example, ecological considerations. So sustainability transformations, for example, sets a lot of pressure for our aesthetic preferences to change towards a certain direction. And other values, ethical, economic values, they always are kind of reflected also in our aesthetic preferences to a certain degree. But of course, as human beings, we are also complex creatures. We can sometimes like things that we know are ecologically destructive, but nonetheless, it's kind of considered in urban aesthetics that it causes some type of friction when we gain new knowledge of the issues at hand, and when we realize that something that we have considered to be beautiful, aesthetically positive otherwise, is actually destructive for the environment or socially unsustainable. These are some of the examples. And this kind of phenomenon in ecological aesthetics, in environmental aesthetics, has been described as aesthetic disillusionment. Cheryl Foster has written about this topic, and it's really kind of a concept that you can apply through different branches of aesthetics quite well. And it describes the phenomenon when new knowledge causes friction in our aesthetic appreciation, and we then move towards a more informed aesthetic judgment. So we are maybe better able to justify our judgments, or our aesthetic values might start changing slowly because we kind of realize that other values are in dire contrast with our aesthetic preferences. And this is why I always try to emphasize that values become perceivable in the form of aesthetic choices to a certain extent. Of course, not always, but I think this is a very important tool for sustainability transformations, for example, and also something that can be understood in the mobility context quite well. So we might be more prone to select certain types of public transportation, for example, if we realize that it would be ecologically, ethically, socially a better choice than private car use, for example. So then to the topic of aesthetics and mobility. So how are they linked? I think there are some quite natural, easy to understand links between aesthetics and mobility. By using different modes of transportation, we gain different types of experiences of the city. The speed of movement, for example, can be quite different when walking or compared to like metro transportation. We don't get the same sceneries outside. The experiences can be quite drastically different. So different transportation modalities offer different manners of movement, and there can be quite many variables that affect these experiences. And different transportation modalities offer different affordances for sense perception and attention. And I think this is maybe the best starting point for understanding why aesthetics is important for understanding also mobility, human mobility in cities in particular. And here's a quote from Jonathan Muskett, who has been studying this area from a phenomenological point of view. So how we move through a space is not merely a question of convenience or efficiency, as very often in transportation planning. This is still considered to be a matter of efficiency, that people would always quite logically choose the most efficient, most convenient way of moving around. As Muskett states, rather, our transportation technologies can fundamentally shift how we experience where we are. And this is also something that it would seem quite intuitive that people take into account when making these decisions. But to what degree, of course, we need to look a little bit further into that. And not only the transportation modalities as such affect the experience, but there are a lot of contextual factors. So the speed, duration of the transportation moment, visibility, other human and non-human agents that take space, or that the same route, ease of interruption. These are some of the things mentioned in the literature. But also our modes of navigation, taking into consideration congestion, traffic rules, they have an effect on kind of how our experiences unfold when moving in the city. And choice of modality is also linked to the choice of route. And this is something that links now quite well to my case example, which is the Urban Aesthetics in Motion project. This was a joint research project between University of Helsinki, which took the lead of the project, Aalto University and City of Lahti in Finland. And it was a really nice way of collaborating between philosophy professionals, spatial planners, planning theorists, and then the city officials, who of course wanted to gain more knowledge of how the city is used, what kind of places the citizens appreciate, what kind of places could be somehow easily kind of made into better conditions for moving and so on. So the idea was to bridge the gap between philosophical aesthetics and urban mobility futures, really trying to develop a conceptual framework for this type of work, but then also kind of immediately take that work into practice and see how it could improve places, improve the citizens' experience of the city. And there was especially focused on favorite routes, so which kind of routes people choose and select in the city based on what type of preferences. And as part of our research group, there were environmental psychologists, and really from many studies within environmental psychology, there is already knowledge that aesthetic preferences actually rank quite highly in people's preferences for route selection. But it has never been kind of taken any further, like what are the aesthetic preferences that people refer to. So because aesthetics can also be quite a broad range of concepts that people apply to their experiences, so we wanted to dig a little bit deeper into that with the means of philosophy. And the aim, yes, was to take this into planning processes, and one of the goals in the city of Lahti, which is a very car-oriented city in the Finnish scale, they wanted to increase walkability, but to do that wisely in places where it would be most beneficial for the citizens and for the overall transportation, like traffic flows. So that was like one of the goals. And I selected some outcomes. There were over 20 published articles based on this project. I'm of course not going to go through all of them, but I chose two specific cases that were the outcomes of the research project. And the first one was a survey, Everyday Places and Routes, that was an online map-based survey for the citizens of Lahti. We got almost 800 replies, and people were able to draw and map their favorite routes in the city, and also like think about which transportation modalities went with which route. And then it was taken through cluster and space syntax analysis. And we found some quite interesting things from these familiar places in the city center. Negative experiences were mostly linked to intersections with heavy traffic. I think this is not a very surprising result, but then we got like some concrete information about which were the places more specifically. And positive aesthetic experiences were linked to recreational areas, parks and such, where there was no heavy traffic, where there was more greenery present, but also there was some overlap. So it wasn't a very clear case that positive experiences would be only related to parks and recreational areas, but sometimes even the heavy traffic intersections were chosen for certain aesthetic reasons. And one of the main outcomes for the philosopher part of the research project was increased knowledge about the terminology that people would use to describe their aesthetic experiences related to mobility. So of course there were some traditional concepts such as beautiful or ugly, but also mentioned were spacious as an aesthetic concept, so people were appreciative of places where there was high visibility, space between buildings and so on, or space to move around more freely. Then also homely was one of the concepts that I'm not sure has been used that much in aesthetic literature, but that came out consistently throughout the research. And then also these kinds of concepts that are more familiar in the everyday aesthetic branch, so referring to kind of organizatory principles as messiness or unorganized. These were in the negative side of the scale of aesthetic preferences, and noisy, taking into consideration the auditory experience, the more multisensory experience of these spaces. And we gained through the survey increased knowledge about places for future development. Another selected outcome, this is a very different type of work, was an article that was published in Behavior and Information Technology in the Smart Cities at Play special issue. I co-authored this together with Vesa Vihaninjoki, Seeing You in the Familiar, Intensifying Aesthetic Engagement with the City Through New Location-Based Technologies. And I'm just briefly going to state the main kind of aim or the main goal of our article. It was to kind of show tentatively, to speculate the idea that GPS-based navigation actually doesn't hinder from experiencing the city as we sometimes very naturally like think that when we are using the navigation technologies, or like we're just looking at our phones instead of actually experiencing the environment. But we wanted to point out that it opens also new possibilities for experiencing the city, specifically with aesthetics in mind. So discovery without getting lost was one of the things that we proposed, and also attention to details. And our case example came from Pokemon Go game. So when it really kind of helps you to go into places where you wouldn't otherwise go, but it also points out these details in buildings, in urban places that you might otherwise just miss even in your most familiar environment. So this article was an attempt to bridge the macro and micro layers of urban aesthetics in this sense. Coming closer to the end of my talk, these are the main takeaways that I'd like you to remember after the talk. So in general about aesthetics and urban aesthetics in particular, what is valued aesthetically is most often linked to other values as well. So these choices and aesthetic preferences they are not born in a vacuum, but they are really kind of heavily affected by our sustainability considerations, what we think of socially just in different environments, how ecology and ethical considerations are also presented, how they enable our choices. I think that's a very kind of important thing to take into consideration, although the extent of this kind of value deliberation can differ quite a lot depending on the context and on the case. The available mobility selection in the city affects the overall aesthetics of the urban environment, but also the lived experience of the everyday. So this kind of dual nature of urban aesthetics, it's also present in our mobility decisions, mobility choices, and preferences. So the macro layer, so this kind of more general understanding of the aesthetics of the city, and then the everyday dimension. Aesthetics also, aesthetic preferences play a role to some extent in how one moves in the city. So as in the case of Lahti, people showed quite interestingly intricate, even like detailed understanding of how they sometimes might select a longer route just because there is a beautiful scenery if they have time. So this is one example of how aesthetic preferences come into play in choosing mobility modalities within the everyday. And then choice of transportation modality affects ability to survey one's surroundings and what draws attention in the first place. So in this sense, it's not insignificant what type of transportation modality is selected, but it really kind of affects the overall experience. Okay. Here is a list of some of the published works based on the research project, and more general references, a selection of them. There is a broad range of work done in the intersection of everyday aesthetics, urban aesthetics, and philosophy of technology. But now I'm really looking forward to questions and comments. Thank you.
So we have about 25 minutes left, so questions.
Hi, thank you very much. It was a very interesting talk. I have a question about how the political intersects with these aesthetic values. And it occurs to me that the question I'm posing is definitely coming out of my context, which is coming out of basically a city and a country that's highly inegalitarian, as opposed to, I think, the context in which your research is. So the question may seem a bit foreign, given that difference, huge difference in context politically. So, I mean, as someone living in Seattle, right, where there's a lot of confrontation, I would say, between elements. So what I found myself thinking about in terms of the aesthetic of the urban area is how various resistance groups form citizen coalitions to fight back against, say, like the city trying to expand the parking lot to make it easier for cars to go on a ferry, and then citizen activist group forms to try to save the Children's Cove and the Salmon Run, and then mobilizes through a set of whole citizen body to push back against, basically, it is a government, it's part of the government, right? So then you've got, protest movements forming, right, to draw attention to power structures that need to be transformed. And then this evokes, many different emotional responses depending on your socio-political location, your socioeconomic location. So I think about like people's preferences around where they want to commute or where they want to go. I found myself asking, well, what is their identity? What role do they have? What kind of privilege economically do they have to choose to say, oh, I want to go and move through a space that is beautiful because why? It's affluent. It's extraordinarily affluent. As opposed to a place that is extremely impoverished. Or you think about like people who don't have houses, who are forming homes and communities in the city, which then becomes highly politicized, right? But it does force a confrontation around the inequality, right? That can move a citizen body to make different decisions, when they vote about how resources are to be allocated. So the kind of aesthetics that come to mind for me is actually one maybe that is associated with movements of revolt or resistance that often invokes feelings of horror, disgust, where the feeling of the ugly becomes extraordinarily important in transforming something for sustainability, broadly conceived, not just as environmental sustainability, but as sustainability that imports the value of equity. So I'm speaking, this is just maybe something that is coming out of the specific location I'm in, but it's not just my location, right? I mean, this is a reality globally, the rise of just staggering inequality around the globe. So I'm just curious how much, you know, your research and your familiarity with, others' research on aesthetics of cities deals with this political element, specifically around inequality and how that informs aesthetic preferences and how, you know, the design of the city isn't just thought from a top-down perspective, from the standpoint of resistance against a structure that needs to be revolutionized.
Yeah, thanks for a really good and important question. I think one way of approaching these kinds of conflicts between how the city is governed and how the citizens or activist groups experience and express what should be done or what should be said and so on, I think they sometimes at least culminate with the conflict between the macro and micro aesthetic understanding. So sometimes like the idea of what the city kind of should look like or what kind of expectations we have for certain places can easily be kind of overriding the everyday experience and this sort of very kind of basal level experience of the city that we gain only through everyday encounters, everyday engagement with the place. But of course that shouldn't be the case. And when it comes to making these social injustices visible, I think Robert would be not very good person to discuss more. So for example, as a case that he has been studying extensively on hostile design, kind of makes actually concretely visible in cities that there are very active ways of pushing certain groups of people out and making their lives more difficult. And this is something that you don't necessarily don't know how to interpret, but once you gain an understanding of it, you start reading the affordances of the place in a new light. And maybe that is one example of aesthetic disillusionment when you understand, when you gain knowledge, and you start seeing the place in a completely new light. So that starts eroding your appreciation, even of a place that you previously found really kind of aesthetically possible and pleasing. I think this would require a much longer answer, but thanks for the question.
Thank you very much for your thought-provoking talk. And in that connection, I'm wondering, could you share your thoughts on how coerced immobility affects the overall aesthetics at a macro level of an urban environment, as well as aesthetic preferences and aesthetic values? The rational motivation for my question were the COVID lockdown measures for densely populated urban environments. Could you share your thoughts on how?
Yes, thank you. Yeah, I think COVID, the whole pandemic and the lockdowns especially were like an important moment to reflect our everyday environment, kind of unfolds within the everyday, and how much we rely on different transportation modalities that were all of a sudden they became like a threat or something that shouldn't be used or couldn't be used. And really pointing towards the most immediate surroundings. I'm not sure if we have really like kind of still used that understanding to maybe develop planning processes further. I think the work is still ongoing, but I definitely hope that would increase our understanding of like how the most mundane, everyday surroundings and the opportunities for mobility in general, how they affect the livability of our cities or the quality of life on an everyday basis.
Okay, thank you. Hi there. My name is Vincent Blokwaard from the university. I'm not familiar with this field of aesthetics, but I was triggered by the reference to the affordances that you introduced. Because the affordance theory is more familiar also in philosophy of technology, if I'm familiar with that. And you seem to connect affordances with aesthetics and with values, while in my understanding, affordances are relational phenomena to the extent that they are primarily affording behavior. And I was wondering whether it is appropriate then to connect it with the aesthetics of an object, so to speak, as if there isn't, or is it not the case that you then, in a way, presuppose a sort of subject-object dichotomy in which there is an object, an artifact with a particular visual characteristic that we can translate in terms of affordances, while the theory provides us the opportunity to think about this in more relational terms. And also to the extent that there is not an object with a characteristic that affords something, but you only engage in this aesthetics in your behavior, and that it's even constitutive for the subject in this relation. And if we look at this from a more relational and a behavioral perspective, can we then still refer to values? Is then value the key term that we should refer to if we talk about design? Or is then, do we need another type of vocabulary that is taking this relationality more serious? That's just, I was wondering about.
Yes, thank you. I only referred to affordances. I think there is still a lot of work to be done on that side, like linking kind of this sort of urban aesthetic point of view and the affordance theory. But I think there, for example, looking at our cities, when there are very often a lot of elements that come from previous generations that have been designed with certain things in mind, certain values, certain aspects, just the cultural context has been dictating how things have been done, and we now currently live with the traces of the previous generations, of course giving our own meanings, our own interpretations to the elements. So I think that the kind of idea that there are certain affordances, but they are contextual, they are in a way always relational, and I think this actually quite nicely fits with Arnold Berland's ideas about aesthetic engagement, that we always bring to the situation a lot of elements with us, and that the aesthetic experience kind of really happens in this engaged, temporally unfolding, like coming together of like what we are sensing, and which we are part of the whole situation, and not necessarily object subject dividing very strictly, but the coming together is maybe the moment where the aesthetic experience happens. But I think affordance is, because it is, as you said, very much a link to the philosophy of technology side and our understanding of human artifacts, and it also links design to urban environments. I think it definitely would need to be studied further with this in mind. I think it's a very useful concept.
Hello, thank you for the talk. My name is Joel Block. I'm a PhD candidate in philosophy at DePaul University. And my question is about, I guess, the various role of the various senses in the aesthetic experience. And correct me if I'm wrong, but it seems like you've mostly focused on the visual experience of cities in terms of ugliness and beauty. But one thing that strikes me, I guess, when I visit a city or as an inhabitant of a city is also the role of smells and sound, noise. When I go to New York City, I'm always struck by how much it smells like garbage and urine. I live in Chicago, and Chicago is quite famous for its elevated train lines. One line in particular, the Brown Line, interweaves between various apartment buildings and is quite an amazing visual aesthetic experience when you're on that train. But if you live in one of those apartments, it's an awful auditory experience at the same time. Whereas being here in Tokyo for the first time, I'm quite struck by how many people there are everywhere, but there's relatively low noise pollution compared to what I'm used to in Chicago anyway. So it seems like many of these various different senses can actually come into tension with each other in the aesthetic experience of the city. So I'd be curious to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, thank you. I cannot emphasize enough that the aesthetic experience that I'm trying to describe would be very multisensory. I think that one of the problems is that we always discuss aesthetics in these types of settings. I have my photos, I have made a selection, they represent some of the ideas to give you an impression of what we are discussing, so that already directs it into the very visual direction. And maybe the overall kind of intuitive idea is that aesthetics is somehow, like even sometimes used as like a synonym for visually pleasing, and it's not the whole truth, of course. I would say that the macro aesthetic layer tends to be more visually oriented, so when we are discussing representations of cities, and that can be often quite distant, this sort of landscape aesthetic point of view to the city, to the urban environment, but then the micro perspective. Maybe tonight there is a city tour, if I understood correctly. If you go around in Tokyo, you might really take this into consideration and try to focus on how different senses contribute to the experience. I would say that even like culinary culture of a place is part of the micro-aesthetic perspective, and the smells definitely, and how the air feels, and like humidity that can be even kind of touched by our senses, and all these kinds of things contribute to the experience, and they cannot be so neatly distinguished. So like all the senses really working together, but I think that is inscribed in the idea of aesthetic engagement, that we kind of are surrounded and part of what is happening, like through our whole bodily organism. So the whole time when we are awake, basically, we are part of this urban system when we are in the city.
Thank you for a very interesting talk. I had a question about the development of aesthetic judgment. Most people aren't born with it. That is, it can be developed either through educational systems or through informal interactions. With the project you have going on in the city, which sounds great, did you decide that you were going to take the citizen views as they were, or is there some kind of educational or informative component to the project?
Thanks. Yeah, again, really good question. I would say that just by replying to the survey, like people already have to kind of flex their like thinking towards discerning between like what kind of experiences they have and trying to find an apt concept to describe the experience. So I think that is already kind of almost pedagogical in itself. We have now one researcher working on aesthetic sensibility, which is a concept also used by Yuriko Saito in everyday aesthetics. Yuriko Saito has been, in a wonderful way, bringing Japanese aesthetics concepts to everyday aesthetics and really increasing sensibility already by doing that. But the idea that your ability to discern, to make judgments, make informed judgments, or sometimes just postpone your aesthetic judgment, like sometimes you don't have to like always go with the first impressions. It's also to some extent skill-based. And I, for example, I teach at the School of Art, Design and Architecture, so for future design professionals, it's a very competed institution to get into. So I definitely noticed that like all the students, for example, they already have during their first year, the very first studies, kind of very high level of this sort of aesthetic sensibility. So I do think there are differences in that, but I would be very hesitant to say that would somehow qualify you to make aesthetic judgments. Like I still think that it's very important to kind of give people right to have their opinions and aesthetic preferences, like independent of the fact whether they are design professionals and so on. So I think it's sort of the liberation between different views is essentially part of aesthetics always. Like the fact that there are different opinions about beauty is not an inconvenient thing, but it's a richness. That's why we need to discuss aesthetics.
Thank you very much for your keynote talk. I was captivated by your use of the notion of aesthetic disillusionment, and precisely how it also relates to inequality and perception of injustice in the city. And I'm wondering, do you see perhaps any kind of connections and or maybe differences to another concept of ideology, or maybe ideology precisely in the understanding of hegemony? Because for me it seems there is definitely a connection in this kind of metaphor of being disillusioned by something, and then being disillusioned by it when you see all the injustice that is kind of entangled with it. So I was wondering how you maybe see the connection between this notion that seems to belong to the aesthetic domain, but also the ideology one, which I guess has to do more with nexus between politics and epistemology.
Yeah, thanks. I actually haven't thought about that connection, but like concepts of ideology and hegemony what really seem to be maybe better related and better suited for the kind of political realms for encountering social injustices. Aesthetic disillusionment comes really from the cognitive aesthetic side in environmental aesthetics, and it was kind of mainly developed to show how our scientific understanding of the phenomena that we are assessing influences our aesthetic appreciation. So there's a lot of kind of almost nitpicky like argumentation towards how you should almost be like an ecologist in order to appreciate certain types of natural environments, and like what amount of scientific knowledge would be enough to make an informed aesthetic judgment. But I have been using that in a broader sense, and especially in the urban environment, it's of course not only ecological knowledge, but really like a much broader set of facts and ideas that we need to take into consideration. But what is the amount, what is the extent that can be expected from a regular urban dweller? I think that is still an important question. But maybe like the aesthetic disillusionment comes from a little bit different angle than the concepts that you were introducing to the discussion.
I'd like to step back and ask you about the city as the sort of unit of analysis. Like maybe this is a really basic question, but it seems like at least some of the ideas that you presented to us today, although couched in your research here as things that apply to the urban environment and philosophy of the city, I wonder if at least some of them apply to the built environment more generally, and like perhaps refract differently, but are still useful in other human living environments, human working environments. So like, sort of why the city, and then what changes when we take these ideas out of the city and put them somewhere else.
I was afraid that you would be asking me to define what is a city. Yeah, definitely these are applicable to like to a broad range of types of the built environment. I'm not trying to define the city, but like I would see that there is a certain kind of threshold in urban environments where the complexity of the system somehow evolves to that kind of state that we can talk of like some sort of urban metabolism, or maybe especially related to traffic, that there is a certain, and of course it depends on the city in question, but this type of experience of complexity, which I have been developing in other circumstances, it's also kind of, I would say they're typical for the urban experience, and that can gets manifested in aesthetic ways. For example, when we're traveling, taking the metro, we are never perceptually able to grasp the entire system, but we still kind of know that it goes on until eternity, at least here in Tokyo. So that is like an elemental part of the experience. And I've been trying to deal with that as an experience of complexity. And that might be missing from some smaller areas, or like, and I think this is a good question, maybe in the sense that in Finland we have a lot of cities, but if you look at the global scale, I think maybe only one of our cities would be kind of count it as a proper city or a metropolitan area. Like the inhabitant numbers are so small, so that how to define a city is a very concrete question, also with the city of Lahti in mind. I think it's getting very late. Do you want to Robert close the session? I want to thank everyone for the questions and comments. And please come to the morning session, the mediators.
Excellent, thank you so much. Bring this to a close for today. This brings us to a close for today. See everybody in Thank you. I think you rephrased my question. Burger wet, but